invite. Thanks for allowing me to be here with you today. And thanks for showing up for 90 minutes to talk about money, talk about finances. It's often for most of us, unless I saw a treasurer in the group. Um, they might like money or talking about money and having these conversations, but the rest of us, it's not what we signed up for when we got into board work or nonprofit work, but it's a necessity of the job. So we're gonna dive into some of those topics today. My name is Adam Jesperson. I'm the Associate Director with the Montana Nonprofit Association, coming to you today from Helena, where we have our office and our headquarters. I'm actually joining you from my home today. We have a different training in the office that the rest of the staff is engaged in, and bandwidth is an issue. So I decided to stay home so I could make sure that this could work well for us. We're going to just cover some introductions about what we're going to talk about today, but just some housekeeping. I have the chat open here. So as we're going through this, I would love for this to be conversational. We're a small enough group that if there's something that is not connecting with you, if you want further clarification, want some more detail, please put that in the chat, put a question, raise your hand. I also have your beautiful faces up here as well. So you can just come off, open up your video, come off mute as well. And let's, no need to wait till the end. Let's just take this right in real time as we're working through our content for today. I am the Associate Director with M&A, and at M&A, I teach a 6-week series called Financial Leadership, where it's for board and staff, and it's kind of designed for like the non-finance leader within an organization to know what they need to know to integrate finance into their job. So it's a 6-week series where we talk about what are our major financial statements? How do I read them? How do I analyze them? How do I interpret them? How do we budget? Which is what we're going to talk about here today. So this content is adapted from this larger series. When we're working through the year, how do we make sure that we're on track with our budget? What does a good budget report look like for the board, for senior leaders, for program staff? How do we tier that in a way that makes sense? How do we think about cash flow, which is something that's distinct from budgeting, distinct from our budget performance because of our accrual accounting and all these little things. And then cost benefit analysis. How do we think about programs and initiatives and expansion and equipment and capital and all those big things from a financial perspective so that we can make a sound decision financially in conjunction with what does this mean for our mission. In addition to financial leadership, we've also taken that 6-week series and distilled that down into a 2-part series called The Board's Guide to Money, which is what does a board member need to know to be competent in being the fiduciarily responsible party for a nonprofit organization. So we talk about financial statements, we talk about board reporting, we talk about a finance committee, we talk about this concept of restricted funds. I give you all of that because the content we're going to talk about today is pulled from these 2 series. So if this resonates with you, if you come through this 90-minute session, you're like, hey, that was good, I would like more. And I think some of my board colleagues or my staff colleagues would like more. We have options for you to get that. So we're going to offer the Board's Guide to Money next month, December 5th and December 12th. There's a link in this slide deck, which you will receive. And there's also a link in the chat if you'd like to register for that. And then we're going to offer Financial Leadership, the bigger series, the 6-part series in spring of 2024. You all, just by being here, by reaching out to us, we're offering you 20% off the cost of that series. And there's a discount code here that you can use when you register to get that 20%. If you happen to be a member of M&A, there's going to be an additional discount. And if you happen to have our All Access Pass, which is a 1 fee for all training for the year, then these series will actually be free for you. So that's my shameless plug for our work, but really we found these series to be really helpful and beneficial for folks, just understanding their role within their organization and handling money, managing money, and integrating money with mission. That's really kind of the heart of this. It's not about internal controls and policies and dollars and cents and audits. Like we really try to focus on how do we know enough about the financials so that we know what we know, so that we can make good programmatic decisions for our mission within our organization. So if you would like more after this 90-minute series, please avail yourself of either the Board's Guide to Money or Financial Leadership. where we're going today. So we're doing our intros right now, and giving an overview where we're gonna head for the next 90 minutes. For the rest of this time, we're gonna spend the first half talking about this concept of financial leadership. What do we mean when we say that you need to be a good financial leader within your organization? What does that mean? And again, it's that integration between money and mission. We're going to go through a top 10 list that was sent out to folks in advance. If not, we're going to go through it step by step here and have a conversation around what those 10 steps are, around what are the finance essentials for a social sector leader, and that's board and staff. If you're leading an organization, what are the essentials that you need to be focused on to lead the organization well? And I think you'll notice that, again, we're not talking about having clean audits. We're not talking about good accounting. That's kind of a prerequisite. We're talking about once we have good accounting, once we have internal controls, once we have policies, how do we use that information well to lead the organization well? We're going to talk about this concept of the mission money matrix and how do we think about mission impact and fiscal sustainability in conjunction with one another, knowing that there's a tension there sometimes that we can sort of program our way out of existence if we're not careful with managing sustainability and impact. Then we're going to pivot and spend the last part of our session talking about budgeting. And again, this comes from the session that we have in financial leadership about budgeting. We're going to go through our process that we recommend for organizations to build a budget, the process of that, what a budget actually is, how to think about variances in the budget and assumptions that go into that. And then we'll spend the last part of our time going through a budgeting template that we are giving to you that will be emailed out or provided to you. If it hasn't already, it will soon. But we're going to go through that and just provide a tutorial of how to use that tool. But it just walks through our process for budgeting step by step in an easier fashion. Highlighted cells, fill in the cells, it does the work for you, and gives you, I think, some pretty powerful tools to think about uncertainties and risk and articulating our assumptions when we're actually building a budget for the year. So that's where we're headed for the next 90 minutes. Again, please feel free to use the chat. If you have any questions throughout any of this, raise your hand, turn on your camera, come off mute, get my attention, whatever you have to do. Let's make sure that you are getting what you need from this. So first of all, defining financial leadership. What do we mean? Again, we're not talking about debits and credits or audits, internal controls, policy, those types of things. We're coming kind of one step above that. We're talking about the business model of the organization, how revenue and expense hang together for the sake of mission, how we integrate money conversations into strategy and decision making as the board thinks about generatively around where are we headed, where are we going, where have we been, what's working, what's not. How do we make sure that we're incorporating what we need to when it comes to finances into those conversations. So it's the integration of management and mission. It's where we can integrate the finance aspect into what we do, how we do it, and what we value, our big vision for the future, those types of conversations. We all have a role within this. And that's the first point to underscore here. Whether you're on the board or a staff member, if you're here, you know you have a role, right? Like you've taken the time to say, I need to learn some more. And I need to understand what that role is. But please understand that every staff member, every board member, every volunteer in your organization has some sort of a role in financial leadership. If you're a board member, you are the fiduciary. Ultimately, it's your problem, right? So you have to make sure that the information that's in the 990 is correct, but also that the assets of the organization are stewarded in the best interest of the organization. If you're a director, an executive director, a C-suite type of person, you feel this. You're probably the person that's building the budgets. You're the person that's creating the reports. Like you're the person that has to make payroll every 2 weeks, every month, whatever it might be. You understand that. Program managers have a stake in their part of the budget or the whole organization, but they've got a piece of that. Our frontline employees have to know, hey, what's my spending authority? Where do I have control over certain aspects of money in and money out? How do I make sure that we are efficient with cash in the door so that we can get it in the door and out for the sake of mission? Even our volunteers need to understand like their role in managing the assets that they have been charged with volunteering. So everyone has a role. We get that. We need to understand what that role is. We're going to start with this concept of finance essentials for social sector leaders. So this is a resource that comes from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. They're a national consulting firm that works with nonprofits on finance. It's in their name. And they provided this top 10 list that I think is really grounding for us in helping to define what financial leadership means. So as we go through this, I'm going to go through it step by step and kind of expand on some of their points of what it might mean for you. And then we're going to stop periodically and I'm going to ask for a pulse check. I'm going to ask for you to use the chat and say, all right, from 1 to 10, 1 being we don't do these at all, any of them at all. 10 being we've got this and got it in spades, and I feel comfortable with all of these. Where are you? So it's a good grounding, I think, for you to see where you are with your peers here, and also to help you focus on, hey, if we were to set some goals for how we want to grow and develop over the next 6 months or 12 months, what might some of those areas be? And we can expand on that and have some conversation around that as we dive in. So the resources, the top 10 essentials for social sector leaders. Number 1 and number 2, I think are adjacent to each other. One is that good nonprofit leaders can keep mission, capacity, and capital in balance, and they never ignore the dynamics of the enterprise platform. So they introduced this concept of the enterprise platform, which is that graphic there. Advance my slides. And all of this is saying is that mission doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we know this. We know this intuitively that we can't just wake up and say, "Hey, we want to do good. We want to have programs and create mission impact," and then it happens. Mission really is the deployment of capital, money in the door, cash that I can spend that we use to purchase capacity, and capacity is people, and it's infrastructure, and it's food, and it's travel, and it's consulting, and it's all these things that we spend money on. It's our expense lines. The combination of those are what lead to mission. We know this intuitively. We all know that me with $30 in my pocket have much less capacity for mission than the Gates Foundation with $30 billion in assets. But oftentimes we're not able to kind of right size our mission with the capital and capacity that we have available to us. So we have maybe a huge lofty goal of solve world hunger or cure cancer in the world, but our capacity isn't. It's more local. It's more grassroots. Like we don't have a lot of capacity to do that work. So understanding the balance between those is important. And then there's this concept of the enterprise platform, which again is this combination of capital and capacity. Capital is money in, funding sources, our donations, contracts, grants, cash that we can spend, that we spend on capacity, that we use to hire people, that we use to lease a building, that we use to have technology, that we use to deliver meals, those types of things. Have a shelter for animals, whatever that might be. That's our enterprise platform. Your enterprise platform for your organization is unique to you. The cocktail of revenues that you bring in, your ability to bring those in, the uncertainties that surround some of those, and what you use those resources to spend on to create capacity, those are unique to you. For some of you, that enterprise platform is more durable, right? You have more ability to raise more money or have more donations or get more grants, or you have different earned revenue sources. For some of you, it may be more tenuous. Maybe you're just starting out, or maybe you just lost a funding source, whatever it might be. But we need to be able to articulate what's the enterprise platform. This is also, you could probably call it the business model or the cost structure, but it's kind of the foundation of, hey, how do we bring in resources and spend resources for the sake of mission within our organization? I think it's a great conversation for boards to have, is to identify, hey, what's our enterprise platform here? What's our combination of capital that we have? And what are the capacities that we are purchasing with that capital for the sake of mission? A great way for you to identify and define what your enterprise platform is to simply look at your budget, look at your statement of activities, your 990, whatever that is, that shows where money came in from and where it went out to. and take the top three largest line items of revenue and add those up. What are they? And how much money does that equal for you? The top three probably equals 80 to 90% of your total revenue for most organizations. And from that, you're probably able to say, hey, 50% of our money comes from this source, 20% comes from this source, another 10 from this source, and the balance is, from another 10 or 12 different sources. Kind of the Pareto principle concept, where 20% of your items, in this case, we'll say three, equals 80% of the impact, 80% of the revenue. The flip side of that, on the capacity side, look at your expenses, what you spend money on. Look at those top three items and identify, okay, where do we spend money? For most of you, unless you're an all-volunteer organization, probably your single greatest cost is going to be personnel. Knowing what that percentage is as a total of the whole budget is an important thing to keep track of. And then identifying what those other costs are. But I think you're able to kind of get a brief snapshot of what your enterprise platform is by identifying your top three revenue sources, your top three expense lines, and what story does that tell? That's the story about your business model. It's a story about how things hang together. Where is there risk? Where is there uncertainty? Where have costs changed? Understanding the dynamics of that, and how more money equals more mission, how more expense equals more capacity for more mission. Those are great conversations for boards to have and for staff to have, leadership to have within an organization to really hone in on how do we do what we do? How do we use the resources within this organization? So first concept, this concept of enterprise platform. We're going to have, I think, a little bit of time towards the end of our first session here, just to have some conversation around that. But if anybody has any questions or wants to expand on this concept, please put that question in the chat or raise your hand, and I'm happy to take that. Secondly, or I guess it's number three, but it's our second major point, effective nonprofit leaders are proud of their nonprofit tax status. Nonprofits exist for a reason. We fill a gap that government or private business can't, shouldn't, or won't. We're here for a reason. And there are tax benefits. There are certain benefits that are tax exemptions that are provided to us because of what we do, because we do what we do. So being a nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. I think when we get into budgeting, we'll talk about budgeting for a surplus. When we talk in financial leadership, we go pretty far into that just budgeting for zero is not the goal. Like, we can have a profit, we can turn a profit. The only thing we can't do is pay out profit to shareholders, to owners, because we don't have any. The community owns nonprofits. We have moral owners, which is the board, but we don't actually have owners with equity stakes in organizations that can take the profits from an organization. But we can have a surplus, and we can have a profit, and we can invest those profits back into the organization to grow assets and grow mission and grow impact within our organizations. So yeah, it's a tax status, not a business model, and we should be proud of that. Nonprofits is the only industry in the world where people will just give you money without anything in return, right? They will cut you a check as a donation because they want to support what you do. We need to lean into that and be proud of that. And utilize all the benefits that go along with that, of tax exemption, tax deductibility for our donors, and not shy away from growing our assets, turning a profit, paying our people a living and a thriving wage to do the work that we do, and creating impact in our communities. Effective nonprofit leaders insist on having clear, reliable, routine, management-friendly information. Each of these adjectives it means something. So clear means it's understandable and it's current, which means we know what we're seeing. We know when we get our budget, when we get our kind of profit and loss for the year, for the quarter, whatever it might be, we understand how to read it. We understand what the line items mean, and what revenues and expenses are tied up within each of those line items. And it's current, meaning we are not Our programs are named for what they currently are, not what they were 10 years ago when we set our accounting system up. Our chart of accounts is in line with where we actually currently bring money in and spend money, not with what it looked like 10 years ago when we set up our accounting system. We need to edit our systems as we evolve as an organization so that we know as leaders coming into organizations that we know that we know what we're looking at. It makes sense, it's current, it's understandable. Reliable means it's accurate, which means that we can trust the information that's there. It's good accounting in, which leads to good reports out, and it's complete. We're not going to get oftentimes boards will say, hey, I want to have the financials no later than 5 days after the close of each month. But what they're sacrificing oftentimes in that case is that they're not getting accurate information or complete information because all the expenses haven't been put in yet, or there's still some revenues being sorted out. I would rather us all wait an extra 2, 3, 4 weeks after the close of a month to make sure our information is accurate, complete, and trustworthy before we review financials. It's okay to kind of have some time lapse to make sure that we know the information is clear, accurate, and trustworthy, and that there's not any surprises that are going to kind of hit in 2 weeks after we've already reviewed the financials and had them approved. This next one, routine, goes along with that, that the information is received on a timely schedule and a consistent format. We should be able to have a routine system for being able to review financials so that we get familiar with what we're seeing. It's much easier to see trends, much easier to see outliers, much easier to see information that is really important to us when we know what the format looks like, and we can see when things are changing. We can see how things are changing, and understand seasonality and cyclicality and how things change from quarter to quarter. If that format is consistent, we're much more able to see that. So ask for consistency, ask for clarity, ask for accuracy. And lastly, management friendly. We should be able to take our financials, and depending on the size of the organization, this may apply or not. But we should be able to tier it to the end user for what they need to see to spark the conversations that they need to have. Oftentimes, when nonprofits give financials to the board, they just give them everything, right? They give the full chart of accounts, it's 60 lines down to the penny on everything, and it's accurate, right? And it's clear in that like everything's there, but it doesn't focus us in on the conversation that a board needs to have, which is probably about that enterprise platform. It's about long-term program sustainability. It immediately hones the conversation in on, hey, why were we $50 overspent on postage last month, instead of hey, we got this major grant for this program initiative, or we didn't get this major grant for this program initiative. That's the conversation the board needs to have. So I want to cater the financials that the board sees at top level for the initial conversation to guide that, to spark that conversation. That doesn't mean that they don't get all the detail or can ask for all the detail if they need it, but I'm not going to lead with that. Same with my senior leaders. I'm going to lead with the information that's going to be useful for them to spark the right types of conversations. And then for if for program staff or for end users, for those folks that are really in the weeds with the numbers, they should get the detail, because they're the folks that are going to see if some of the accounting was wrong, if something got put into a different account than it should have, or some of those like little detailed conversations about being overspent on something. $50 of postage is a good example. But I want to kind of tailor that information as best I can, so that we can have the conversations we need to have with the stakeholders that are around the table. All right, effective nonprofit leaders can tell their program story in financial terms and their financial story in program terms. So this is where we're able to talk about how capital leads to impact. This is that enterprise platform conversation again. We're able to tell our community, tell our donors, tell those that support us that, hey, your investment of $100, $1,000, $1 million will lead to this outcome, because we have a good handle on how money equals impact within an organization, and how more money equals more capacity, which leads to more mission. We can make that connection and tell that story. All right, top 5. These are more kind of business model and reporting type conversations. You think about your own organization, from just in whole here for these first five, where do you think you are? A one is I don't know what you're talking about on any of these. We don't do it. 10 is I think we've kind of got these five dialed in pretty well. I feel comfortable with where we're at. Where would you find yourself, your organization at this point in time on these five? Please feel free to use the chat and just type in the number one through 10. Let's see which brave soul will go first. 7 or 8? Yeah, that's good.
Is this about my organization or me? Because I'm a lot lower than that if I'm talking about me personally.
Yeah, no, I would say for the organization, and we're in different spots with our roles within the organization, but that's great. All right, an 8, a 6, 2 to 4, an 8. Yeah, so there's we're some folks a little less, but other folks feel like they're pretty comfortable with this, which is good. That's a good place to be. Thank you. We're gonna do one more of these as we move through. All right, number 6, effective nonprofit leaders can predict how their organization will end the year financially. When we get to budgeting, we'll talk more about this, but this doesn't mean that we have a perfect crystal ball and we can guess 12 months in advance where we're gonna end the year. It's not about guessing right. It's about understanding those major drivers, that enterprise platform, major drivers of revenue and expense, and understanding what levers we need to pull to make sure we end the year where we want to end the year. We have control over how money comes in for the most part and how money goes out. And so understanding your enterprise platform, having good reports allows us to know what levers we have to pull to end the year where we want to end the year, whether that's up or down or whatever it might be. So it's not about guessing. It's not about prediction. It's about management as we move through the year. This is a big one, number 7. I think it's definitely a big one for boards who are maybe less familiar with looking at nonprofit financials. Effective nonprofit leaders understand that they manage in a looking glass world, commercially speaking. Looking glass world means, it's from Alice in Wonderland. Up is down, down is up, right is wrong, wrong is right. Things don't make sense. Things aren't as they seem. And we have some of that in nonprofit work. We have this concept of restricted revenues is a big one, where we might get a grant that says, here's $10,000, you can use it for the summer program, or you can use it to buy a van or purchase that building, whatever it might be. I'm going to show my financials that I've got $10,000. My 990 is going to show that I have $10,000 in revenue, but I can't use it for payroll. I can't use it for utilities. It's for a very specific purpose. So I'm going to show on my financials that I have a surplus, which is great. And the board might say, yay, we're rolling in dough this quarter or this year. And the executive director or the board treasurer is saying, hey, we've got cash flow problems. So understanding the nuances of money and money that I can spend versus money that I can't. Oftentimes, we'll also see where you'll get a restricted grant for programming in the future, and that programming might span multiple quarters or even multiple fiscal years. But you have to book all the revenue when you get the grant or get the award letter that says, congratulations, you just got a 3-year grant. So you're going to book that revenue here. You're going to show a big surplus in the year in which you book that revenue. But you're hanging on to part or most of that money until future years when you can release it and spend it. But I can't carry that revenue forward and book it in those fiscal years. So I'm actually going to show a deficit. Or at least I'm not going to have revenue that matches those expenses in those future fiscal years. So this is where oftentimes boards will get, again, we need to understand what this information says. So we need to understand, is that surplus really a surplus for the year, an operational surplus? Or are we hanging on to restricted money that we are going to have to spend in future years? And then in those future years, is this deficit really a deficit? Or is this us spending down restricted funds from previous fiscal years? Having those nuanced conversations is important. When we get into our financial leadership stuff in our longer course, we talk about how to manage restricted funds and how to build internal financials at least that can carry some of that revenue forward. On our 990s, on our audits, we don't get to do that. We have to show all of it, all the revenue in here, and the expenses in different fiscal years if they happen to span those. But internally, there's some conversations we can have. So it's one of these examples of sometimes what we see isn't actually reality, and we need to be able to understand the nuance of that, and have conversations around what it actually means. Sometimes cash is fungible or not. Sometimes cash is what we can spend on payroll, and sometimes we can't. This concept of overhead. There's the notion that the best nonprofits have low overhead. The best nonprofits need to be efficient with how they spend resources, but we have to have IT people, we have to have HR, we have to have accountants, we have to have management and governance, we have to have costs that support the backbones of our organization. We shouldn't shy away from that. We should be willing to invest in what it takes for us to be sustainable and impactful in the long term, which often means overhead, for lack of a better term. Salary growth. There's also the concept that hey, if I'm paying someone, that means that money's not going to mission. I'm paying a staff person, and that money could be going to serve the people we serve. The reality is that the person I hire is serving the people that we serve, and it's probably your single largest expense. And it's okay to invest in your people and have good, competent, trustworthy people representing your mission. That's going to come back to you tenfold versus trying to skimp on salary because you think that that's not going towards mission. And then growth. Oftentimes, some organizations will say, "Hey, we have to grow our way into being more sustainable. We have to be in more programs, more services, more revenue streams for us to be more sustainable as an organization." Is that true? Is that not? Sometimes it depends. It depends on what we're going after to understand whether that truly is the case. So again, understanding the nuance of what we're looking at, making sure that things are clear, current, and understandable is important as we try to lead organizations, because sometimes things aren't what they seem. Effective nonprofit leaders understand that they run at least two businesses. They've got the mission business and the mission support business. The mission business is the service that we provide to our community, to our state, to those that we serve. The mission support business is how do we bring in revenue? This may be fundraising, this may be grant writing, this may be government contracting, this may be fee for service, whatever that might be. It may be bake sales, whatever it is. We have the mission business, we have the mission support business. And sometimes the competencies that are required, the people that are required, the resources that are required are different from one another. What it takes to raise money, what it takes to write grants, what it takes to work with Medicaid and fee for service and all these different government contracts and mechanisms are much different than what it takes to serve folks in our community, right? So we need to understand what the competencies that are needed for each of those different types of businesses, and understand that sometimes those are at odds. At the end of the day, we have limited resources that we can spend within our organization, and sometimes we have to make a decision. Are we going to spend this dollar for more mission? Are we going to invest in our ability to raise more money, to raise more capital, to make sure we have the infrastructure, the people, the systems to support that work, which will come back to us, theoretically, come back to us tenfold into the future. But there's a tension there. There's a tension we need to recognize and deal with. Number 9, effective nonprofit leaders understand that growth is especially demanding in the nonprofit world for commercial reasons. We have less ability to generate capital. We can't just go to a bank and say, "Hey, I want to take out a $50,000 small business loan to serve this community, the underserved community over here." We have less ability to quickly raise capital. We can't sell shares within our organization, equity stakes. We can't oftentimes go into debt to expand in certain areas. So it's more capital intensive with less capital options. It takes more time. There's more risk involved. There's never a shortage of opportunities to do good. There's just a shortage of resources, and we need to be careful with that. We need to be careful with this concept of growth and how we do it sustainably. When we talk about budgeting here towards the end of this session, we'll talk about knowing our core, knowing the base, knowing those things that we need within our organizations literally to survive, um, and making sure that those are protected, and supported by core revenues. And then growth can be, with different types of revenue streams, new revenue streams, but it's incremental, instead of kind of betting the farm, betting the mission on a growth strategy. So we'll talk more about that as we dive into the rest of our time here. And then number 10, effective nonprofit leaders can distinguish between regular operating revenues from capital and extraordinary revenue. This kind of goes in that same conversation of knowing your core. So we should know that our core mission expenses are funded with regular recurring revenues, and growth and expansion opportunities and capital expenses, buying stuff, updating buildings, having vehicles and technology and things like that, are tied to different revenue sources. So that the core mission, this is the point I just made, I should have waited a slide, that our core mission isn't put at risk for the sake of growth. We know what our core is, we know how our core is supported, we know how to mitigate risk within the core of our organizations, and we're not putting that at risk for the sake of growth into a certain area. Okay, that's a big one, I think. So 6 to 10, how do these resonate with you? 1 through 10 again. The concept of looking glass world, two businesses, and growth and core. I see a 9 and a 7. Okay. A 5. Yeah. I expect that, the average score here will probably cluster a little bit lower, but I'm seeing some higher scores, which is good. A savvy group. Typically, when I've done this in the past, this is where those scores tend to drop off. So that's good. All right. Yeah, Sabrina, I hear you. Again, you're just getting established. I think this is a good, um, and maybe less of like where are we currently, and more of there's some good goal setting here for you as you start to get the backbone of the organization established. Uh, Thank you for sharing. All right, so the next resource we're going to talk about, so that's kind of a top 10 list. I think that's a great resource to give to your boards, give to your staff leadership, and have the conversation we just had, and understand within those 10 items where you have some work to do for yourself, to get to a point where you feel comfortable. That's financial leadership. If you can hit those top 10, you are a good financial leader for your organization, knowing that there's a lot that goes into each of those items, right? A lot of good accounting, a lot of good conversations, a lot of good planning processes, and all of that. But that's kind of the crux of leading, from a financial standpoint. The other concept that we want to touch on here today is this concept of the mission money matrix, which is that all nonprofit leaders need to manage by a dual bottom line. A dual bottom line is our ability to create mission impact and our ability to be fiscally sustainable in the long term. So we're able to actually look at a programmatic level and have conversations about, hey, is this program what we want it to be from a mission perspective? And is this sustainable, for us into the future? Sustainability looks differently. If you're primarily raising money, that doesn't mean that it's not sustainable because you have to raise money. Are you able to raise money to support that? Do you think your fundraising towards that program is sustainable because of the mission impact it has and the call that service has to your community? That's sustainability. It's probably as good as you're going to get, because there's not a lot of fee for service opportunities within that. But it's, if you'd like to learn more, there's a website, nonprofitsustainability.org, to learn more about this. But truly, you can take each of your program areas, and sometimes even that conversation is hard for folks, to think about. When we think about what we do as an organization, how do we break that up into 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 program buckets, which is distinct service offerings, and how do we map them out on this little 2x2 matrix? Where one axis, the x-axis, is fiscal sustainability. How sustainable is this in the long term? And the y-axis is how impactful is this from a mission perspective? We have that, if you look at the graphic on the right here, if we have start in the lower left corner, we have some services that we provide, some programs that we offer that have low mission impact and low sustainability. Uh, these are things that we probably want to stop or limit or find ways to move it, but we don't want to be doing those services that we can identify and say, hey, this is no longer relevant. It was probably relevant at one point in time. It no longer is. And by the way, it's also not sustainable or profitable for us. We want to stop the bleeding in that area. The lower right quadrant, these are kind of the money tree is the graphic there, but these are things that maybe have a lower mission impact, but they're very sustainable. So this might be, if you're chase a certain grant opportunity that comes down the pike and you're like, this doesn't really fit why we were created or what we do, but we can kind of fit ourselves within this and it pays pretty well. And maybe it subsidizes some other work that we do. So we're okay doing that. But maybe it's not the reason we were created. It doesn't have the highest mission impact, but it's easily sustainable. The top left quadrant then are heart services. I think where most of us have our services when we actually have folks chart out where they fit on this spectrum. Oftentimes people end up here where we have high mission impact, but sustainability is hard. Sustainability is the trick. And these are heart services, or we do it because it creates the impact that we want it to create. It's why we exist. But it's hard at the end of the day to balance the budget. It's hard to make it sustainable or profitable. And then the top right quadrant, which is those services that are high mission impact and high sustainability. That's where we're trying to move everything, right? And we can move that we can increase sustainability by increasing revenue or decreasing expense. Impact is oftentimes, I think, everything we do is the highest extent of what we want to do, and it's hard to kind of split hairs on what impact really means. So some of the ways in which we can tease out differentiators in mission impact, or to ask some of these questions. First is this concept of scale versus depth. So scale is how many people does this program serve? Maybe it's broad based. It serves the whole community, but it does so at a transactional level. They're in, they're out. They got the thing from us, and they move on with their life. So it has scale, but it doesn't have a lot of depth. Depth might be, how profound is the impact of this service, program line on those that we serve. So maybe we only serve 5 people with whatever the service is, but for those 5, it changed their life. Obviously, if you have scale and depth, you've got a winner, right? But more often than not, there's a sacrifice between scale and depth, and we need to have those conversations as a board around what we're after. Are we after scale? Are we after serving as many people as we can and having as large of a headcount as we can in our service lines? Or are we after depth? Or if we're after scale, how can we try to increase depth as best as we can? Excellence of service. For that which we provide, do we do it excellently? And what leads to our ability to provide excellent service, knowing that probably changes over time. This is, I think, oftentimes where we see a program go from being a heart service or a star service into being a stop service, is the landscape changed with their ability to provide that service. A staff member left who held a lot of responsibility, and we can't replace that person, and we can't be excellent at that thing anymore. Or the funding landscape with our funders or the state or whoever it is changed. They kind of swept the rug out from under us, and now we can't do what we did previously. We need to be real with have those conversations and understand, okay, where are we right now? What's our ability today to provide excellent service? And is it what we want it to be? And if it's not, how do we change that? Either by finding ways to increase the excellence or to decrease our exposure, decrease the financial outlay that goes into that service. Competition, and maybe less competition and more, are we the only people in the community that do this? Or are there others that provide something similar where if we went away, someone else would kind of fill this gap? And if there's no one else, if we can say, hey, if we went away, this part of our community has nothing, that's high mission impact, right? And then again, we have our stated mission, we have our vision, we have our plans. How aligned with those plans is that service? It tells us, how impactful that is. So these are ways you could go through service line by service line and say, all right, this service is here's the bottom line, financial bottom line. And then here's the context about mission, scale, depth, excellence, competition, and mission fit, to actually chart out for your service lines where they fit on this matrix. A great exercise for a board of directors to do annually, every other year, or anytime you feel like the landscape shifts in how you provide your services or financially how it all hangs together. A great exercise to come back to and say, all right, let's look at our matrix and see where we sit right now versus where maybe we were last year at this point in time, and why, and what are we going to do about it. All right, any questions about this, the mission money matrix? Anything that folks want to add to that, or if maybe some folks have done some exercises with this, it's a common thing um, that you wanted to speak in. Feel free to either raise your hand, come off, turn on your video, or chat in a comment or a question. Okay, I'm gonna keep us moving. For the sake of time, we are not going to talk about goal setting, but I think you saw that top 10 list. You saw the mission money matrix. You gave yourselves some scores within that. And I think a great takeaway for you would be to ask yourself, when you think about the next 12 months, what do you as a person want to focus on to grow, to be better aligned with those top 10 finance essentials? And then what should be a goal for your organization in the next 12 months when it comes to growth and development? Where's an area that you could devote some time to become better aligned with those finance essentials, or this concept of a mission money matrix? A good exercise to spend a couple of minutes and just jot down some goals. Now we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about budgeting, which is, one of those things. It's the probably everyone's favorite four-letter word. It's not a four-letter word in nonprofit world. The budget, right? This oftentimes we're in different places with this. Many of us may be well tuned in to the budget. Some of us maybe have a budget that isn't really a budget. Some of us may have the budget that we do and get approved, and then we don't review it again. Maybe some of us don't know what's in the budget or don't know how to build that budget. So we're going to dive into M&A's process for a team-based process for building a budget that can allow us to capture risk and uncertainty, and some of the narrative that goes into how we come to what we came to as far as numbers that go into the budget. When I say the term budget, I'm asking you to use the chat here. When I say the term budget, what's the first gut check response that comes to mind for you? What are some of the words or phrases that come to mind for you when I say it's time to budget? Planning? Yeah. Strategy? All right. Y'all are good. I was looking more for the gulp, don't make me do it, whatever it might be. Programming goals, call Amanda. There it is. Ulcer, there it is. Information priorities amongst team. Programming goals. Yeah. Yeah, Linda, great. So we're going to step back, and first we're going to define, what a budget actually is and what it's not. A budget is a story. It's a story written in financial terms about how we're going to bring in and spend resources for the next 12 months for the sake of our mission, that should align with the planning and the strategy work that we're doing. So it's taking that strategy and planning work, and it's telling a story in financial terms around what that means from a dollars and cents perspective. That budget, those numbers, that story, that narrative is based off of all kinds of assumptions around how we think the world is going to look in the next 1 month, 3 months, 9 months, 12 months, what our programming is going to look like, what staff are going to be on board, what funding is going to come through, what the stock market's going to look like, what the weather's going to be. All of these things get built in as assumptions as we're putting numbers onto a piece of paper that say, here's how we're going to spend money and bring money in. I think this is the important point. So on just name this and read it. A budget's a story, a plan of how we're going to acquire, utilize resources to fulfill our mission. It's based on a set of assumptions around what the external world's going to look like, what our internal world's going to look like, and how we're going to operate within that environment. Usually, we assume incremental change. We assume that the future will look like the past and that our plans will be incremental compared to prior years. So we'll take last year and we'll add 3%. We'll take last year and we'll subtract 3%, whatever that might be. We use last year as a baseline. But there's all kinds of assumptions that get built into our thinking as we put down a number onto a piece of paper. And sometimes our assumptions are good and sometimes they're not. We have two classes of forecasters, those who don't know and those who don't know that they don't know. So there's a limitation to what we can actually know as far as what the world's going to look like and what our program is going to look like 12 months into the future, 10 months into the future. We have some limitations. So we have to build a budget. We have to build a plan that accounts for the fact that we're not going to get it all right, that there are varying degrees of certainty, there's varying degrees of risk associated with the decisions that we're making, and there's some unknowns around what our circumstances are going to hold into the future. So we need to have a process and a budget that accounts for that. Our process is 7 steps, and they're big steps, but it's 7 steps. The tool that we're going to spend the last 15, 20 minutes going over, tutorialing, takes the 7-step process and just walks through it step by step from start to finish. These 7 steps are articulating our assumptions, unifying around values, vision, need, and capacity, resources before revenue, being realistic with our revenues, knowing our core, reconciling, and adjusting. We're going to go through these step by step. So the first is articulating our assumptions. Again, I just said that when we build a budget, we end up with a number. We put a number on, what staffing costs look like in March of 2024. Within that, there's a lot of assumptions that went into building that number. We want to be able to actually articulate with a narrative when we build a budget what our thinking was that led to that number being put in there, and what we think the external world is going to look like at that point in time, so that when we get to March of 2024 and our number is wrong, we can go back and say, all right, we thought through this, our thinking was stinky, it was not correct, or we didn't anticipate this, or we didn't anticipate that, therefore we need to make this adjustment, or therefore we know we're off because of this reason. If we don't articulate those assumptions, we're kind of guessing, and the further you get out from the present, the harder it is to remember, what were we thinking when we built the budget back in November of 2023 about what our revenue was going to look like in December of 2024. So articulating those assumptions which in narrative form with as much detail as we can, and articulating where we have uncertainty, where we're actually going to be able to say, hey, we're going to put this number in for donations in December of 2024, but we think it might be plus or minus 20% from this. We think there's that much spread, or 50%, or we may not get that grant, in which case this number is not going to be what it is, what we budgeted. So getting those assumptions articulated in the plan. Secondly, after we've talked about our assumptions, talked about what we think the external world's going to look like, we want to have some unity and some consensus as a board and a staff around how we need to show up in this next 12 months. What does success look like? Most of us have the plan. We have our strategy. We have our vision. We have our strategic plan for multi-year, whatever that might look like. And we need to say, all right, based off of that plan and based off of who we've been previously, what does success look like for us for these next 12 months? What's the need that we're going after? What's the imperative that the board is putting on the staff or to the organization saying, go do this? And what capacity does it take for us to do that? Again, that enterprise platform. What do we have to have on board? with us to get that job done? Is there consensus around what our service lines look like, what our programming looks like, and what our direction looks like for the next 12 months? Again, that's a no numbers conversation. That's just us getting consensus on how we want to show up for the next 12 months. Then we're going to focus on resources before revenue. That means we're going to focus on expenses before we focus on revenue. And we're going to have, with all of the stakeholders within the organization, a no numbers meeting where you're going to get your staff together, get the board together, get whoever has a responsibility for building the budget or managing the budget. And you're going to say, okay, we have consensus that we're going to do these 10 things or achieve this objective in the next 12 months. You all who are doing the work, what's it going to take to get that job done? And again, this is no numbers. We're not talking about costs on any of this. You just want folks to be able to say, if we're going to do that, I need 3 more people, or I need a new computer, or I just need an office that's heated better, or whatever it might be, or we need this kind of a campaign in our community, a mailing campaign or a brochure or whatever it might be. But you want to avoid that scarcity mindset where folks immediately will say, their first question will be, well, what's my budget? And then I'll tell you what I need. We want to avoid that conversation. We just want to get, all right, all in, if money weren't an issue, what would your program look like? Now we have to back our way into what's realistic, but that allows us to dream a little bit, and that allows us to create some really easy campaigns for raising some more money if we're able to really well articulate, if we only had this much more money to do these 3 things, we could create this much more impact. So allow your staff to dream, allow the board to dream, allow the organization to dream a little bit and say, all right, if money were no object, how would we approach the vision, the mission that we've established for these next 12 months? Then we've kind of popped the bubble a little bit, but we do so in a way that's not harsh. But then we talk about revenues. Then we look at the capital that we can expect to bring into the organization in the next 12 months, and we're realistic with what those revenues might be. And we try to capture areas where we have unknowns and uncertainties, where we might have some risk, and where those risks may be large and where they may be small. The tool that we're going to walk through does, I think, a really good job of really articulating where you have risk, where you're highly reliant on a certain type of revenue, and where that revenue may come in and it may not. So we can capture that risk, be conservative with our revenue assumptions, so that we're not kind of betting the farm on what we have to identify, and then capture any revenue restrictions. Anytime where you have revenue that you are going to bring in and you can't spend it on payroll or utilities or the mission, but it's for a particular purpose, identify that, so that again, when it comes time when we're reviewing our financials, we know that certain monies are tied to certain expenses and others aren't. Number 5, then we've talked about this a little bit, is knowing your core. So after we've looked at expenses a little bit, we've looked at resources, revenue in, we should be able to articulate, all right, this is the core, these are the expenses that, and the things that we have to spend money on, that if we don't have, we literally don't survive. I want you to think about like the core of your body. If you get stuck in a Montana blizzard, your body is going to do what it needs to protect the core, to protect survival. We want to have that for our organization, where we know that, our budget might say we're $1 million organization, but our core is about $500,000. So we need to make sure that we have enough revenue in the worst case scenario to cover that. Know the core, know our sustainability plan to survive into the future, and make sure that we have the revenues needed to support that, even in the worst case scenario. Then we reconcile, then we create the gaps. Then we look at the gaps between our dream expenses and our realistic revenues. We see what that gap is. We've got to reconcile that and get it to be break even or a surplus budget. But those gaps, then the gap between, if we had everything we wanted and what we think is realistic, that becomes a great goal for fundraising, kind of the value added fundraising that we can take to our community or a new funder or a new grantor and say, hey, we think we can do more. And if we had this much resource from y'all, we could do this much more impact and this much more programming in our community. That becomes a great goal to then give back to the staff to say, we heard you, we heard your dream. We're not able to get to all of that today. We understand that, but now we've really articulated well what it's going to take and what we want into the future to be the organization we think we can be. Last step, then, we make adjustments. We get in the weeds on certain line items. We make sure that everyone is clear on what is actually tied up into what revenue lines, and same for expenses. We communicate. Every staff member in your organization, every board member should be familiar with the budget, the whole budget, what it means, what it says, and what's tied up into each of those lines. And then what story does it tell us? Again, back to the enterprise platform conversation. What does the sum of my 3 largest revenue lines and my 3 largest expense lines tell us about our business model? What does it tell us about how things, where we have risk, where we have uncertainty, where we have things that are changed from last year, maybe? Is it kind of rinse and repeat from prior years, or is it a big shift? Is it a growth budget over prior years, or is it consistent? Where are we seeing some pushing of profit margin in certain areas because of changes in expenses, or where are we seeing a decrease in revenues because of change in donor support, whatever that might be? What's the story that goes behind that is tied to the assumptions, right? So we start with story and we end with story. And that becomes a great starting place then when we use the tool that we've given you, that we will go through here in just a second. You end up with a really powerful planning tool that as the year then plays out, you're able to go back and say, all right, we've thought about this. And we understand the risk that we're facing. And we understand that, we were right with our thinking and we know what we're going to do. Or we were a little off in our thinking, but we know how to adjust. Because we've had those conversations, we've communicated, and there's consensus around how the world looks and how we want to show up throughout our year. All right, questions about that, or any comments or feedback on that process? We're going to look at the template, I think, which walks through this with more detail and should maybe reinforce some of these topics, but I'd be happy to take any questions or comments or have a conversation around how this might look for you. Maybe if you're just getting started, Sabrina, and you're trying to figure out what does this look like for a budget period, or if you're well established and you've got your own process, how this might be integrated within that. So happy to have that conversation for a couple minutes before we look at the template.
I've got a question, Adam.
Yeah.
For organizations that have several discrete programs running simultaneously, is this a template you apply to each of those individually, and then there's an overarching application of it for the whole organization?
Yeah, if you have discrete programs and you're trying to build a program budget with your own program revenues and expenses, we recommend that you use this template for each individual program. And then you'll see when you get to the end of it, you end up with a monthly budget that's pretty easy to just consolidate 3 or 4 different program budgets into one organization budget that then gets uploaded into QuickBooks or whatever it might be.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. All right, we're going to switch screens here. Come on. Okay, so here's the template. It has a number of different tabs at the bottom that follow the process that we just outlined. It also has an instructions tab on the first tab that you feel free to use to walk through this and understand what you're looking at. The first tab that we look at is our scenarios. This is articulating our assumptions. Step 1 of the budgeting process, where we get to create different scenarios that we want to start to build some budgets around. So you have the ability to do 3 different expense scenarios and 3 different revenue scenarios that can be tied or can be completely independent of one another. And you may decide you don't want 3 of each, that would be overkill, but you have the ability. But this is our chance to articulate what we think the external world is going to look like and how we want to build our programming based off of our plan, our strategy within that. So if you want to look at different expense scenarios, like maybe one is kind of a status quo from prior year, maybe plus or minus 3%, but it's just kind of a same expense budget. Maybe you have one that's a growth model and one that is a cut model, where maybe you have to, if things were to go bad, if a grant didn't come in or fundraising didn't come in or something happened, what might that look like? And so you would just articulate the assumptions that go into this. So this would be status quo would be that 2024 looks similar to 2023. Our annual gala brings in slightly more. We get grants from A, B, C. Again, like you're looking into the future and saying, all right, we're going to assume that these things happen, and that the stock market looks good through the fourth quarter of 2024, or whatever it might be. So internal and external, articulate your assumptions. You have something to go back to and say, hey, we've done this thinking. Growth might be if we get grant X, we will expand program B. We will also increase personnel costs by 15% across the board. Cut model is, we don't get grants from foundations A and B. You get the picture. Revenue then is the flip side of that. We're able to say, best case, what does it look like? We get all these grants. Foundation revenue looks like this. So it's maybe a reiteration of the top half, but you can model out kind of a best, moderate, and worst case with whatever that might look like for you. Tab 2 is the only tab that doesn't tie to the rest of this or tie to the process, but it's just a personnel worksheet. If you don't have an easy way to capture like what it costs you to have people all in with taxes, with benefits, with all those things, this is a great worksheet that can allow you to do that, where you're actually going to type in each staff person's name, each staff person individually. If they're salaried, you'll put in their annual salary. And you have the ability to articulate if they receive benefits or not. So let's say, yeah, this person receives benefits. And again, you may have those calculations already, but if you don't have what we call our fringe benefit rate, which is in addition to your salary, how much more do you have to spend per employee when you factor in health insurance, retirement, life insurance, taxes, et cetera? What does that look like? So you can, first of all, you can calculate your fringe benefit rate by taking all your staff salaries. So maybe your total personnel costs are 200,000. You spend 15,000 on this, 10,000 here, spend another 15,000 in medical insurance, 5,000 in life insurance, 10,000 here. So your fringe benefit rate is 27.5%. So in addition, for every dollar you spend on salary, you're spending an additional 27.5 cents on ancillary benefits. This percentage will then be added to whatever salary you put in to give you the total cost per employee. And if you have folks that are hourly, let's say we have, put myself in again, and let's say I'm hourly, you can say how many hours are you budgeted? Default is 40. Are you seasonal, or you work all 52 weeks? You get paid $20 an hour. You budget 5% overtime at time and a half. And this person gets benefits here's the all-in cost of someone who's hourly with those different parameters. So again, this doesn't tie into anything else, but you can see you can actually just type in your staff, calculate your expenses. It gives you your total personnel cost up here as a running total as you go through this. All right, tab 3, this is where we start to talk about resources before revenue. We want to focus on expenses first, right? We want to have our folks dream a little bit. What's it going to take? What do they need to do their job? You'll notice that you have a bunch of lines for personnel expense if you want to have a line like staff by staff, or you can just have one line for personnel. Occupancy, your space, your utilities, maintenance, and then a long list of others. My recommendation is that you look at your chart of accounts, you look at your budget that you currently have, your different expense lines, and you just key those in, type those in as is into column A for personnel, occupancy, and other. Use whatever terminology you use, and then you're going to put in a baseline number. That baseline number should be either what you budgeted last year or what your actuals are for last year, but it's the most current representation of what you're actually spending within that line item in the most recent period on an annual basis. So I might say that, you know, my personnel expenses last year were 200,000, like we just talked about. I'm going to identify that this is a core expense, meaning I don't survive if I don't have my people that are working within this organization. So it's core. And then I have the ability to do some scenario planning, some kind of moving levers up and down based off of the 3 scenarios that we articulated on tab 1, our status quo, our growth, and our cut. And we're just going to use percentages that are going to pivot based off of that baseline number. So we might say status quo is you have the chance to do from 100% of baseline down to 0% of baseline, and then from 100% all the way up to 100 or 200% of baseline. So we might say that status quo is 103%, 3% growth over last year. Our growth model, we talked about that being 15% growth. And our cut model, let's say it's 80% of last year. And as I'm doing that, you can see that I'm getting some numbers for my scenarios, which are just based off of these percentages of my baseline number. So this becomes a pretty iterative exercise that you can do with whoever's managing the budget. You put in all the baseline numbers in advance. Occupancy, let's say that this is rent. It was 20,000 last year. It's core, we have to have it. And it's going to be 100% across the board. We have our space. We're not going to grow our space. We're not going to change it. It's 100% across the board. And then we have something like travel. It's the baseline was $50,000. This is not core. We can choose not to travel and still be okay. And we're going to do 103%, not that. 103% for scenario 1, 115% for scenario 2, and another 75% for my cut budget. And you're gonna do this for all your lines and having those conversations and making some estimates, right? So you're gonna just, these are not exact numbers, but it's a good estimate and a good starting point for conversation where you're able to say, all right, let's look at contracted professional services, or let's look at our printing budget. Based off of how we want to show up this year, let's just do printing. Based off how we want to show up this year, last year we spent $20,000. This year, so as a baseline, do we say, you know, 100? It's going to grow a little bit. What if we expand? What if we do what we say we want to do? What is printing going to look like? Let's just say it's 120. What if, you know, we're not able to do what we want to do and we need to cut some expenses somewhere? What can we shrink this back to? Let's say it's 85, you know, so you're having those kind of nuanced line item conversations, and the tool itself is just going to do the work for you to create 3 different budgets, expense budgets that at this point range from a low of 234 to a high of 331. That's the first step, resources before revenue. Then we're going to focus on the revenue side. And try to reconcile that and try to really hone in on where we have risk and where we have uncertainty with the revenue sources that we have. So you have a lot of lines for earned revenue, which is money that I did something and I got paid for it. So this would be a contract or fee for service or selling a product or things like that, selling a service. Contributed revenue then is someone received charitable tax deduction for giving me a gift. I didn't have to do anything to earn that. I got a grant. I got a donation, special events, mail campaigns, things like that. And then any other revenues like interest income or investment income, endowments, things like that would go down here. But you're going to follow the same process as far as putting in the line items on the left and a baseline number here, and whether that's core or not. Meaning, are you saying like this is core revenue tied to our core expenses or not? So let's say for earned revenue, this first one is fee for service. The baseline number is $150,000. And this is core to what we do. It's part of our core programming. Is the next big question that we have to capture is this revenue variable or fixed? Most of our revenue is variable, meaning it could be anywhere from 150 down to 0 or up. Like, I don't know the exact number, but it's going to be somewhere between 0 and a million, whatever, whatever the range of this might be. In which case, if it's variable revenue, the uncertainty I want to capture is what's the variability, what's the spread, what's the high and what's the low. Some of our revenue is fixed, like a foundation grant, where I'm probably, if I apply for a grant for $50,000, I'm probably not going to get $48,225. I'm probably going to either get a $50,000 yes or a 0 no. I'm either going to get the grant or I'm not. In which case, the uncertainty I want to capture, the risk I want to capture, the variability I want to capture isn't the spread, it's the probability of which I'm going to receive that grant, because those are different. I don't want to say, hey, there's this 50% chance I'm going to get this, therefore I just want to budget 50% of that revenue. I'm either going to get it or I'm not. And a foundation grant is a good example of that. So in this case, fee for service is variable. If I click variable, these cells highlight what's the best case percentage. If my baseline is 150, what percentage would be the best case? If we hit a home run with this line, what would the best case be? And let's just say in this case, it's going to be 105% of baseline. We've had that conversation. We think, hey, if we did the best we could do, we could grow this a little bit, maybe 5%. What's the worst case? Things went bad. What does bad look like? And let's consider that. In this case, let's say that it's 95%. This is core to what we do, pretty tight spread. And as we do that, we can start to see over here we can see it's calculating those percentages. My best case is always my baseline times my best case percentage. My worst case is always my baseline times my worst case percentage. And the moderate case is always the midpoint of the two. And then I'm starting to get these little red, yellow, green indicators on the right that tell me how reliant am I on this revenue source? Like, what if that revenue source is more than 20% of my budget, I'm highly reliant on that. And what risk is involved with this? If there's a bigger spread, I have more risk. So if I were to say, in a worst case percentage here is 75%, there's a little more risk there. I've got a bigger spread. This went to moderate risk. Let's say my worst case percentage is 50%. Now I am highly reliant on this, and there's risk involved, because if things went bad and I brought in half of that revenue, right now this is all the revenue that I put in here. So that means that my budget will be cut in half. I am highly reliant, and there's high risk. I want to focus on areas where I have red, because I want to mitigate risk or mitigate reliance. So let's put this back to 85% moderate risk, and add another revenue source like government contract. That is $80,000. It's variable, and we know we're going to get it. It's guaranteed. I'm reliant on it, but it's low risk. Now let's say for contributed revenue, we have, foundation grant A. This is my baseline is going to be $50,000. It's not core. And in this case, it's fixed revenue. I'm either going to get that grant or not. in which case I need to decide what the likelihood of me receiving this grant is. If it's guaranteed award letters in hand, I can count on it, it's 100%. If it's, we've had some conversations, but nothing's guaranteed, it's 75%. If it's a coin flip, it's 50%. And if it's kind of speculative, less than 50%. If I say it's 100%, that means I'm going to get it regardless. So all three revenue scenarios say $50,000. I can count on it. 75% means I feel pretty good about it, but there's a scenario where we don't get this. 50% is, best case we get it, but there's two scenarios where we don't. And speculative is we just want it to be in here, but we're not even counting on it in any of our scenarios. You can see as I'm doing this, as I'm changing this percentage, my little indicators over here are changing as well. It's low risk if I know I'm going to get it. It's high risk if there's a scenario where I don't get $50,000. I'm going to leave it there. And same things with expenses. I'm having these like line item nuanced conversations by revenue source, and I'm ending up with three different revenue scenarios down here that are tied to each of those line items. Tab 5 is where this all comes together. And I see we've got about 5 minutes left. We're moving through. But this is where all this work comes together, where you can see the net income of where my expense scenarios 1, 2, and 3 meet my revenue scenarios of best case, moderate case, and worst case. So this is where all that thinking, all those assumptions, all that variability comes together into 9 different net incomes if you did all three scenarios for expenses and for revenue. And you can see the result of that. You can see that, hey, we've got some red ink here, which means we might have some work to do. We also have what our baseline revenues and expenses are, which is probably based off of last year. You also have whatever you articulated for your assumptions here on the right. And then down here, this is where you get to start to tell the story of what are we going to do in each of these scenarios? What are we going to do where our status quo, where our best case revenue scenario meets my status quo expenses, which is best case revenue, status quo expenses, $10,000 loss. What's behind that? What's driving that? What was our thinking on that? And what are we going to do either to ensure that that happens or to pivot and alter that to get a better outcome? So you can, again, put in all your thinking here. This becomes a great summary document to give to the board saying, hey, here's all the back end work that went into us building this budget and all of our thinking about how our environment and our services are going to look for these next 12 months. But it's still a lot of information, right? It's still a lot of detail that we still have to end up with a budget that's carved in stone that has a number for each revenue line and each expense line that says, here's how much we're going to spend and here's how much we're going to bring in, which is what tabs 6 and 7 allow us to do. Tab 6 takes all of our revenue lines first that we've plugged in. It has your baseline number. It has all your best, moderate, and worst case. And you get to choose which of these numbers do I want to use for the budget, for the thing that gets carved in stone and approved by the board. Do I want to use the baseline number, the best case, the moderate case, the worst case, or do I not like any of those numbers and I'm just going to override them and type in what I want? In this case, I'm just going to use my moderate case for this, my best case for this. And if I back out a little bit, you can see as I'm making these choices, I can see my little matrix that have my scenarios and where they come together. And I can start to see where am I making choices? Which of the scenarios am I kind of clustering around as I make these choices on a line item basis? For this one, we're going to say moderate case, we think we're going to get this grant. For personnel, we're going to go with 1s across the board, our status quo. And we can see what our budget's going to end up looking like. Just by making those choices, I just made a budget that has a $25,000 net income loss just based off of what I did. And I clustered pretty tightly around moderate revenue and expense scenario 1 right here, which has that net income up there. So I built the budget. I built the annual budget just by clicking some buttons and making some choices around which scenario to use. The last step then is to distribute this budget across 12 months, where you can take the number that you just decided for the budget and decide, do you want that number distributed equally across every month, in equal amounts every quarter, or I don't like any of those options, I'm going to do this manually, in which case you go to column S and just type in the numbers to match. So in this case, I'll do, equally every month for this. This pays every quarter. This pays manually because it's a one-time grant. I see I'm out of time, but we're almost done.
We can take a little longer for whoever can stick around.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Personnel is going to be equally every month. Rent is equally every month. Travel and printing, I'm just going to do quarterly just to get some variance here. And what that then gives me is what's my monthly revenue and expense, monthly net income, so that, timing is the big factor here, which could easily be turned into cash flow. We want to talk about a cash flow projection. We can kind of look at what cash flow is going to look like for the year. Tab 8 then is just a summary that tells us what the budget is, what our profit margin is, how much of our cost is tied to personnel, what's our split between earned and contributed based off of what we did, what's our highest revenue month, our highest expense month, and then what does this look like on a monthly basis. So again, that scenario tab and then the summary tab kind of give us all, those are great pieces to give to the board to say, all right, we've done the thinking. Here's what it is. Here's how it looks. And again, I would encourage you, if you have discrete programs, have your program staff build this. This tab right here, this budget tab, is all you need to key into QuickBooks, and then let QuickBooks roll everything up together for you into the organizational budget. Or you could just do that yourself if you want to have a spreadsheet that has all of that. But you have, your monthly budget, and then your year to date as the budget accumulates throughout the year, what that looks like. This becomes a nice tool as you use this, you build the budget, and then the year starts to play out. You have the master document that says, all right, what was our thinking? Where were we right? Where were we wrong? And what do we need to adjust to get to where we need to be by the end of the year to get to the net income that we have budgeted for? I think this can be a powerful tool. It really helps us articulate a lot of those thoughts that oftentimes we don't, right? We just build the budget, put the number in, and then kind of sort out 6 months later, well, what did we say we were going to spend, and why did we put that number? I don't remember that conversation. It's all here. So that's the tool. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions, comments. Thank you, Rebecca. It seems like it's a useful tool. Our 6-week series on financial leadership, we go through the budgeting process like we just did. We talk about this tool, but there's every week that we have another tool that goes along with that content. So we have a cash flow. We talk about cash flow, and we have a cash flow projection tool similar to this. We talk about budget performance and how to track budget to actual, and we have a tool for that. We have a cost benefit analysis tool. So we really try to make this work as straightforward and as easy as possible for folks who don't have a lot of time, bandwidth, or expertise in finance. Oftentimes, you just need to know your program to build budgets in this way. Thank you for hanging in for an extra 5 minutes. I'm happy to hang on for any questions if you have them. But thank you for being here. And I hope to see you in the future coursework that we might have. Or individually, if you have any other questions or think that us at M&A can be helpful with your board, with your organization, with your programming or budgeting, we're here for that as well. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to hang on with questions.
Thanks so much, Adam. I really, really appreciate this. Is phenomenal stuff, even for
Good.
someone like me who is allergic to numbers. As I said,
Yeah.
if anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or turn your video on. Let us see you, whatever, and go
Yeah.
ahead and ask Adam. If not, I've got a couple of announcements I'll make right quick before we wrap it up.
And Donna asked if she'll get a copy of this to use, and the answer is yes. I sent it off, and so it'll get sent out to, I think, everyone who registered for this series.